It's a real pleasure to be here among a cohort of colleagues. I started life, as you could hear, as an electrical engineer myself, and you know, the kinds of problem solving engineers get up to is always fascinating. Susan, the image that sticks with me is this incredibly exotic Google apparatus perched on the top of a camel. So, of course, that must be trademarked as the camel cam. Yes, it must be a camel cam, and I love that sort of stuff. So what I'm going to do today is talk a bit about this idea of learning engineering and what it actually means. And my perspective on this is to really think about the engineering side of how education works or ought to work. So the analogy for learning engineering is to think about like chemical engineering, right? We have chemical engineering departments, and they are different from chemistry departments. Chemists do fundamental research, follow their nose, small-scale work, trying to understand key issues and questions. But if you're going to build a new pharmaceutical factory, you probably don't want chemists to actually build it for you. They have no interest in economics or safety or health regulations applied at scale. They really don't want to help you at all, and they would rather go back to their lab, honestly. But that's what chemical engineers are for. They've been trained to think at scale. They want to work in an interdisciplinary way, so when they're looking for the right metal and structure to hold 1 million pounds of hydrofluoric acid, this is a fun problem for a chemical engineer. This is not usually of interest to a chemist. So the interesting thing about the education ecosystem, education and training at all levels, is we have now, as I'm going to talk about, a whole range of learning science that's available to us that talks about how does learning seem to work? How does motivation seem to work? And we'll get to that. But what's interesting is we don't, at scale, actually have a learning engineering profession. People who are trained to use the science of learning and apply it within real-world constraints at scale to actually deliver reliable, evidence-grounded solutions and then iteratively improve them. This is what engineers do. We don't really have much of a tradition of that at scale in the education work. So I'm going to talk a bit about this. So the opportunity here is kind of clear about how much potential there actually is for minds to develop. You know, pick any bell curve of characteristic. This could be math performance or chemistry. It could even be non-academic things like communication skills or something about your understanding, your metacognition, your understanding of how learning works. And when you start with the bell curve, if you apply professional one-to-one tutoring to a mind, you can shift that bell curve substantially. Depending on what resources you read, anywhere from 1 to 2 standard deviations of movement are possible with serious one-to-one tutoring applied. So in the case of kids' education, young adult education, and so forth, we actually have to remember this, that the problem is not inside the students' minds. Their minds are able to be moved substantially into real expertise. The problem is we can't afford to provide every student who needs one a professional one-to-one tutor. So this is a real engineering problem. We know what the potential is, but within the constraints of time and resources and money and human beings, how do we get close to what is the potential of changing minds at scale? So what's the way to get at this? Well, you know, we ought to start from how learning actually works. Now, this seems kind of trivial to say it this way, but it's actually not. Too often, learning environments are built and experiences are built based on how we wish learning worked. So, for example, who here has heard about learning styles? Raise your hand if you've heard about learning styles. This is also the awake test. Okay, good. There we go. And what's interesting is it's so seductive an idea that brains can be bucketed. That, you know, there's a kinesthetic brain, there's a visual brain, there's an auditory brain. I'm sure there's an olfactory brain out there. There's some way to teach calculus with smells that I don't want to go into in mixed company, but there's got to be a way to do that, right? But in fact, the evidence repeatedly over decades, when people actually try to compare in controlled trials, carefully done diagnostics for learning styles with well-designed instruction targeting each of those styles, and compare that against single but well-designed, it has to be well-designed, instruction, they have been unable to find systematic differences. So I think the wrong interpretation is to say learning styles can never work. I'm an engineer. I wouldn't have said that. We haven't found a way to make it work. That is clear. And yet, the notion of using learning styles for education is ubiquitous. People are using it all the time. Many of your kids' teachers will talk about learning styles as if this is the key to unlocking. And this is a problem. We should be using the evidence we have about how learning actually works. So we'll come back to that in a minute. The second thing then is, once we have environments or activities that actually have evidence they work, well, then we should use technology to implement those good solutions. So the problem with technology in any usage, as you guys know, I mean, as engineers, technology often doesn't do anything by itself. What it will do in the case of learning, it will take a good learning solution or a bad one and make it more affordable, more reliable, more available, more data-rich. But it will still do that for bad solutions. So imagine for 1 second your worst ever college professor, right? The person that was so confusing, so difficult to understand. We all have those in our background. Think for a second about that. I see a couple of smiles. You know who I'm talking about. All right. Now, in the old days, that person could only damage a few thousand students per year, right? They could only destroy the hopes and dreams of, you know, a few thousand students. Now, thanks to the glories of technology and MOOCs, you can have 24/7 access to this person, and they can destroy the hopes and dreams of millions of learners across the planet. Win for technology, right? No, it's a disaster. That's because you started with something that wasn't actually going to work. It wasn't a good active ingredient, and then you accelerated it, right? So you need to start from things that work and then select your technologies to actually accelerate the things that actually work. So, and then finally, we should be using evidence to make progress. One of the great things about the parts of education that are using technology, because not every part can benefit from technology, but the parts that are using technology, is they throw off more information, more evidence than ever before. People have been doing research in classrooms for about a century, and there are ways in the last 50 years or so to use videotapes and hand coding of interactions to actually get objective information about how teachers and learners are interacting and engaging, but it is expensive and tedious, and it takes years to actually get the evidence. But now with technology-delivered instruction, you can very quickly get a rich tapestry of evidence about what has happened between the learner and the learning experience in the environment, which you can then instrument and analyze in a variety of ways. So suddenly technology is allowing us potentially to make progress much more quickly, and even in the case of large virtual environments, to do things like randomized controlled trials that have been very difficult to do in the past. And then finally, the analysis. Learning is all about your context. What do you already bring in? What is your motivation level? What have you already mastered? And being able to do the analysis of multiple types of students requires big scale, which again, the technology is beginning to allow us to use. So these days is a terrific opportunity to use evidence to make progress. So to me, these things together, they really make up what learning engineering is about. Start from the science, the underpinnings, the active ingredients that actually work, use technology to scale those, and then gather evidence to actually drive things forward. And that's where we should be headed. So a second piece of this that's really important is to not think that when I talk about learning engineering, I'm only talking about academic performance or workplace performance or task performance. So the funny thing about kind of a scientific approach to how minds learn is very naturally in science and very successfully, you split things up. So you in detail look at what affects math understanding, or even addition of fractions with unlike denominators, something quite narrow, and you come up with methods and ways and an idea and try something different. The thing you have to remember is you cannot pull out the human math processor from the brain, tinker with it on a bench, and plug it back into the brain, leaving everything else undisturbed. That is not how it works. So if you are putting a student through some kind of fluency exercise, some drill and kill exercise, which allows you to see a little bit of an increase in their math fluency skills, but it simultaneously destroys their interest of ever doing anything with mathematics ever again in their lives, this is not a win. This is not a win. And the challenge is we often don't measure things like identity development or change at the same time as we're measuring the actual, academic proficiency. We have to think about this multidimensionally. I mean, it's not just about developing academically, it's also those identities as a professional. As you become an engineer, there's an identity to being an engineer, or a nurse, or a lawyer, or any kind of profession at all. That identity development comes along with it and should be thought through. There's also things like your understanding of learning, the cognitive development. What do you know about learning and how to make it work? So many of us in the West have this false myth around talent, that we feel like if this is hard for me, maybe I shouldn't be doing it because I'm not good at it. Well, this is exactly the wrong way to think about it, that in fact, the way you get good at things is by working on them while they're hard. And we get this with things like athletics and music and all that, right? We know that if you're not sweating, you're not working out. And so, we are not simply watching people work out. We're actually trying to work up a sweat. But somehow in the academic and workplace environments, we often don't have that same permission to ourselves that says, I should feel like this is hard. I should get to that stage. And we need to be able to do that kind of thing as well. Even physical and mental health, I mean, there's such fascinating research. Sometimes, especially for kids, but it's even true in for young adults, the best learning intervention might be breakfast, right? If you're in class hungry, and depending on the community you're serving, you may have a whole lot of students who are actually sitting there hungry because they had to choose what to spend on, and they got textbooks instead of breakfast. And they're not going to be able to concentrate. There's research showing that if you keep hydrated, you can increase your problem-solving capacity by like 20 to 30%, right? So maybe the best treatment is a bottle of water, right? I mean, and sleep. There was a randomized controlled trial done on 6th graders a number of years ago. 2 groups of 6th graders. One group got a half an hour less of sleep per night. Yeah, they won. Woohoo! We stay up later. The other group was pushed to get to bed a half an hour earlier. They didn't like their lives, but there we were. And within about 6 weeks, they had a full 1-year difference in academic performance between the 2 groups. That was a 1-hour daily difference in sleep. Led to an almost 1-year difference in performance. And sleep is cheap. Well, if you're a parent, it's not cheap, okay? It's kind of hard, right? And even for us, getting to bed, giving ourselves enough sleep, we often cut it short. And we think we're fine. We're not. It's a cheapest learning tonic you can imagine, is just get to sleep. So, and these are things that we need to include in a full understanding of development and how we progress. So all of these characteristics happen at once. So this is actually a personal story here. So here I was in 2nd grade, showing up, a little furball, and my handwriting is among the worst on the Western Hemisphere or the Northern Hemisphere, or any hemisphere, 6 standard deviations below everybody. And the 2nd grade teacher, she was having everybody start to do a little writing. So her first thing was, every week we're going to do a little writing exercise, a few sentences. You hand them in to me, and then I'll give you feedback, and you'll do that again next week and next week and next week. Perfectly reasonable learning design. So, but I knew what was going to happen. So we do the little assignment, I hand it in. The next morning, she hands them all back to everybody else, and she says, Bror, would you come to my desk? And I know exactly what's going to happen. I'm in trouble again because of my writing. And I show up, she looks at me and holds out the paper, and she says, I can't read this at all. And I'm like, yep, here we go. And she says, so I'll make a deal with you. if you agree to come and give a talk every week in front of your classmates instead, I'll get what I need. And bonus, I won't have to read what you're writing. So that is literally what I did for my entire second grade year. Is I went to the university library with my mom. She was a graduate. She had an alumni card. The security guard was thinking, oh, isn't that sweet? You know, here comes the little 7-year-old, so the mom does work. And I'm looking at the security guard thinking, no, she's got the ID. I can't do my work if she doesn't come with me. She sat and read a novel, and I got books together and dragged them back in. This was a solution to, she had an activity designed, perfectly good activity for almost everyone in the class. Practice and feedback. Very smart. It didn't work for me. So she changed it for me in a way that didn't just allow her to see, does he communicate, can he structure, an argument or structure that, but actually it did more than that. She did not repeat the mistake of prior years of suggesting I'm a bad writer. My identity was actually encouraged to be a good communicator out of that. I didn't pick up that I was a bad writer. I just assumed this was all the same stuff somehow, right? So this is the kind of thing we need to be able to do, because that activity affected a whole bunch of stuff. So we've got to think multidimensionally about how this stuff actually works. So, all right, I'm going to try to give you, I'm going to give you like a 10-minute master's degree in cognitive science. Now, Gregor's in the audience, which is extremely dangerous, because he'll laugh at me because he'll say, I've lost all the nuance in the actual real world of this. You have to understand, I'm an engineer, right? I'm just trying to get some stuff done. So sometimes an engineering solution means you got to synthesize a lot of research into something that's a practical framework. So that's what I'm going to share with you here on the next couple of slides. So a lot of research work over the last 30 or 40 years looking at expertise and learning. Randomized controlled trials all around the globe suggest a fairly common model of how to think about learning and expertise. And your audio and visual information comes into what's called working memory. Now, working memory has several important characteristics. One is, it is very flexible. It's where you do your hard problem solving. Unfortunately, you can't do very much at once. It's quite narrow. It turns out it's pretty error prone. It's kind of slow as well. So it's really, if that was all we had to go on, it would be a problem. The other key thing about this working memory is, this is where your internal voice lives. So if I start talking in a high squeaky voice and you're thinking, this guy is totally strange, you'd be right. But that monologue in your head where you're thinking, whoa, who is this guy and where did they find him? That's happening in working memory, okay? Now, working memory is complemented by an almost infinite bandwidth connection to long-term memory. And long-term memory has completely different characteristics. Long-term memory, as its name suggests, things will last there a long time. If it's trained properly, it will actually be very accurate. It can do many things at once. And it is also, non-verbal, which is actually really frustrating, because if you're trying to understand what an expert has in long-term memory, there aren't words for it. So I'm going to try an exercise here that'll help draw the distinction. Who here drives a car? Raise your hand if you drive a car. Okay, this is good. I tried it in Singapore. It was a disaster. Okay, so now who here has had the following experience? You set out for place A, and then you start thinking about University of Wollongong or your life or family or whatever it is, and you look up and you've gone to place B instead. Raise your hand if that's ever happened to you. Look around, look around. You're not crazy, not for that reason, okay? So, I do that all the time, and I'm usually under-caffeinated or something, right? And I laugh and I go to the right place. But we don't think enough. Who was driving the car to the wrong place? I mean, who was in charge of a ton of metal moving at 20, 50, 100 kilometers an hour for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes? It wasn't you. You were thinking about something else. You were planning your summer vacation, right? And, when you're driving home tonight, look left and look right. Who's driving those cars? Because when there's a fender bender, whoever gets out and starts talking to you, that's not who was driving the car, right? So what that shows is you can put complex longitudinal actions into long-term memory, and the benefit is they unload working memory. They leave working memory free to do other things. And so this is a key part of what experts, cognitive scientists studying experts and expertise have found, is that experts have something like 70% or more of what they decide and do is in long-term memory, which means it's automated, it's fast, it happens very accurately when it fires off, and it is often invisible to the expert. There are no words. And, you know, it's obvious. Well, of course I went left here. I mean, I have to. That's what you do. I mean, and you know your instructional design processes are working about right when every now and then the expert storms out muttering how ignorant the instructional designer is. Because what's happened is the instructional designer is asking questions about what's in long-term memory, and the expert has not thought about it for 10 years. Knows that this is the right thing, can't put the words on it, and so transfers the ignorance to the instructional designer. It's so obvious. You know, what's wrong with you? When in fact, no, it's only obvious if you wired it into long-term memory. So an interesting consequence of this when you think about it is, and we don't do this very much when we think about designing university courses, designing training programs, or thinking through our K through 12 curriculum, what should be in long-term memory? And what should be in working memory going back and forth? Like the driving example shows, some things can be completely in long-term memory and literally leave working memory out. So you can plan a summer vacation while driving to work. However, you cannot plan a persuasive essay and your summer vacation. Right? You can't automate a persuasive essay creation. It is a collaboration between long-term memory and complicated problem solving about audience and topic and evidence and all that kind of stuff. But it still draws on many things in long-term memory for people who are really good at this. So a key thing is trying to figure out, okay, what do experts actually have in long-term memory? And how do we get that to become visible? And then how do we do enough practice and feedback to help our novices get good at this? And this is one of those problems. You know, most career paths, after you finish your training, you go into your first year, and it's often an agony. You know, first-year lawyer, first-year architect, first-year coder, first-year plumber, first-year anything, nurse, paralegal, and many people bounce off their profession because they think, I'm no good at this. I mean, I did everything I was asked to do in my training, but I'm confused. But in fact, the problem is typically experts, when asked to train novices, they draw on their working memory, and so they only tell novices like 30% or less of what they actually need to be able to decide and do to behave like an expert. And so, of course, when you then crash into the real world, you're missing 70% of what you need. And what happens is a bunch of people bounce off. Some keep going. They build up a stock of experience. They gradually then get their own practice and feedback. They begin to put things into long-term memory. They then begin to forget the words that were used. And now they're ready to be faculty members and teach the next generation in the same way that they were taught, missing 70% of what an expert mind actually decides and does. Well, this is crazy from an engineering perspective. Right? That is not how you would design this. If you really were a learning engineer, you would say, let's unpack what's in long-term memory. Let's make it explicit, and then let's make sure that practice and feedback is sufficient for most learners to be able to actually put things in there. So what I was just talking about there was kind of the cognitive design. What are the kinds of activities you need? How does information processing happen? But there's another critical part of learning and other things, which is motivation. How do you get the energy to start, persist, and put in mental effort to do things? And you know, you want good results, you want good testings, you want work results, but within training or learning, you got to have people putting in effort. It turns out it's pretty hard work for a lot of things to actually become good at it. And often students or teachers or employees will just bail. They won't put in effort. And so what do you then do? So when I was at Kaplan, I had a very good psychologist, Richard Clark from USC. he did a synthesis of a whole range of research literature about motivation. He looked at behavioral economics and social psychology and cognitive psychology, motivational psychology. And again, apologies to anyone here who is in any of those domains, because this will look so simplistic. It's just like, I've killed all the nuance and subtlety of many domains here. But this is an engineering framework that Dick came up with as he worked through it. So what goes wrong with people starting, persisting, and putting in mental effort? And one thing I would point out is motivation, I don't include liking. Right? This is like physical exercise. You do not have to like the weights in order to get the benefit of doing a well-designed weight program. As long as you execute it, your muscle cells will change. And learning has much of that same aspect, that you don't have to like it, but if you execute the program, a well-designed program, you really will change your neurons. You can actually change it. And a lot of people who are athletes or artists or actresses and actors, they do things repeatedly that they don't like to do, but they know that's how they're keeping their skills up. And this is the same thing that we need to be looking at as well, is how do we help people recognize they need to start, persist, and put in mental effort. Liking is one reason to do that, but not necessarily the only reason. So there's 4 things that Dick came up with in his survey. One is, do you value what you're doing and how you're doing it? A second is, do you actually think you can do it? The third is, do you think something's in your way? And the fourth is probably the toughest. It's negative emotional states. If you are angry or scared or mad or frustrated, it's really hard to start, persist, and put in mental effort into something, right? And that's as hard as it seems. And through that research, there were also some things you could do for each of these categories. So, you have to value what you're doing. And, a student, I'm a dancer in an algebra class. What am I doing here? I don't want to do this. I'm thinking about Swan Lake. Well, so how do you help a student who just doesn't see the point, a dancer who doesn't see the point? Well, maybe it's about dance foundations. You talk about how when dancers retire, they often want to run a foundation. Well, how much money do you need to do that? How do you make sure you don't get ripped off by somebody who claims returns but doesn't give them to you? That's modeling, it's numbers, it's algebra. That's not the best way to do it, but it's an idea of how you link something like algebra to an interest or a future or a career of a student. Second thing that goes wrong is the self-efficacy, all right? I'm another dancer in the same algebra class, but I can't do math. I have concluded I can't do math. Well, if the teacher bustles over with how important it is and the dance foundation example and yada, 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 you're just making me miserable. I know, my life is over. I get it. I can't do this thing. So that is not the correct solution. That's not the right treatment. You actually have to dig in with the student and say, no, you can do math. We just got to go backwards and find where are the gaps. What is missing in your long-term memory? Where are the fluencies or the conceptual understandings? And we'll create a program of study and practice to get you where you need to go. You can also do storytelling. Have other artists or dancers who had the same feeling they couldn't do math describe how they got over it. So pick some students who are 2 or 3 years later and bring them into the fold and so forth. The third one is different from the first two. The third one is you blame something in your environment. So for kids, my teacher hates me. So I don't start, persist, put him in left, right? Like that. Or I can't understand this textbook. So there's no point, right? Or I don't have any space to work. Or very popular among all professionals, I don't have time to do this. I don't have time. So I don't start, I don't persist, I don't put in mental effort. Well, the trick there is a little bit like the second one. You have to problem solve around. You say, oh, you don't think you have time? Let's look at your calendar. Let's see if we can make time. Let's change priorities. Let's alter where you are and what you're doing. You need some space. Let's look where you are, where you go, where you walk. Can we find space for you? You don't like the teacher. Let's change teachers. Let's go find other resources, et cetera, et cetera. So you're communicating that this thing is under your control. You really can problem solve around it and get them going again. The last one, as I mentioned, negative emotional states, angry, depressed, scared, et cetera. That's hard. I mean, depending on the level or scale of it, it may actually need professional services. It could be as easy as just a friendly shoulder or some workaround, et cetera. That's the really hard one, is, you know, whether it's a colleague or a student, negative emotional states are hard to deal with, but they are very different than the other three. And so the trick is to actually think through, you know, here's little Bror. He looks like a lump. He's not doing any work. Well, he's not a lump. He's a type of lump. What kind of lump is he? And how can we treat this lump, right? And so you have tools and diagnoses and things you can actually do potentially, as opposed to, he's a lump. What can you do with lumps? It's like, no, depending on the type of lump, you may be able to do a variety of things. So, and this notion I mentioned earlier about the whole learner, this idea that you have things about academic issues, identity, social and emotional, and so forth, these actually all tie through to this motivation state. Your identity can drive all four of those things, right? Depending on how you've grown up and what was important in your family, you just have an instant reaction. Oh, I'm a girl, I can't do math. Stereotype threat. I'm not good at that, right? Or you know, but it also can get at even, you know, reactions to environments where suddenly you get anxious at seeing a math equation. And this is an identity piece that's been burned in somehow, and now it just fires off. But similarly, these other areas too, your social and emotional characteristics will definitely drive issues of fear or anger or other things. What you know about metacognition, how learning actually works, may well drive you in terms of what you blame in your environment, or, you know, whether you can actually do it, and so forth. All of these things actually end up tying together. So when you put together all this research, both the cognitive side of it and the motivational side of it, you begin to see that you can really start to engineer learning in a certain way. And you start by understanding what is the expertise. What is in that category of long-term memory, as well as what is working memory's tasks with those long-term memory, and trying to really identify it carefully. There are techniques for doing this. Cognitive task analysis is one kind of technique for doing it. Very good instructional designers do something simpler than that, but again, it's about really interrogating that expert and the expertise. There's also then evidence-based instructional design. Once you know what your outcomes are, you then use evidence-based techniques for designing the instruction. And I'll show a few examples of those in a second. And then you've got to have good measures. And this is a piece that often falls down, especially when you're talking about the non-academic outcomes. We do not have very many good, repeatable, reliable, valid measures of things like your identity, or things like your social and emotional characteristics, or even some of your metacognitive characteristics. We don't have those, but we need them. And so this is a piece to try to bring. And then finally, you can start to use, as I mentioned earlier, technology to let you start iterating more rapidly with the evidence you're gathering, and do things like randomized controlled trials in a way that's kind of an engineering exercise, not a multi-year research exercise, right? And so this is a key part of this. So thinking about those, the understanding expertise and the knowledge outcomes, who here has heard of Bloom's taxonomy? Does anybody here know? So yeah, this is, okay, so yeah, you guys have heard of that, all right? So, and Bloom's taxonomy is like Aristotelian physics. It was designed by people in armchairs doing the best work they could at the time they were doing this, okay? It is absolutely fine work, but done without the benefit of evidence about how learning works that's accumulated now over decades. So some folks at Carnegie Mellon, including Ken Kadinger and some other folks, put together a way of thinking about types of learning outcomes that's more connected to the learning science we now have. And so you start at the top with complex cognitive procedures. So it's things like write a one-paragraph summary of 10 pages of information. You know, many different job things or careers or other things. That's a piece of what you need to be able to do. This is non-trivial. This is hard. But it's a chunk. It's a complex cognitive procedure. And, you know, careers or areas are made up of a bunch of those that you have to do and do them well. Each of those complex cognitive procedures is usually made up of a bunch of supportive components as well. So there are facts involved. There may be concepts involved, which are different than facts. There may be processes that people know how to work and think about the inputs and the outputs to. And there are even some principles involved that when things are foggy, an expert can draw on to say, well, I don't know what's going on, but here's the first step we're going to take. That's a classic engineer, expert engineer approach is, this is really hard, but let's take a first step, and here's how we do it. So the interesting thing about this is there is research now about how to do each of those supportive knowledge pieces. Spaced repetition for facts. Use them in a task-like context, not sitting off on their own on a white piece of paper. Use them in a task-like context, so you're burning in the context as well as the information. And et cetera. Each of these has research behind it. And the key thing to remember, and often this gets forgotten, is it's not enough to master the supportive components. You have to put them all together in doing a complex cognitive procedure, and it's actually hard to put them together, even if you've mastered each of them on their own. This is where working memory starts to get overloaded when you try to use them all at once, and that's why you need to do practice and feedback on the whole procedure to begin to cement the whole work into long-term memory, not just the individual traces and the individual components. And then, on the instructional design side, this is a really excellent resource. Actually, I guess I will try this. Who here knows who Richard Mayer is? Raise your hand if you've ever heard of Richard Mayer. I see one. There's another, a few others. Yep. So who here knows who Eric Clapton is? Raise your hand if you've ever heard of Eric Clapton. Okay, so the sleep test, we're still good. I know I'm the last thing between you and a nice drink, so I know I'm in trouble here. Who here knows that Eric Clapton is one of the world's leading rock guitarists? Raise your hand if that's the thing that you're aware of. Yeah, see, just about, right? So Richard Mayer, by citation, is one of the world's most cited learning scientists. And almost none of you have heard of him. You've heard of Feynman? You've heard of Einstein? I assume you're not here for the quality of the hors d'oeuvres. You're here for the learning work, right? And yet you've never heard of Richard Mayer. Well, this shows, in a way, how kind of broken our culture of learning is, how disconnected the learning sciences is from engineering use of it, to do education technology and to think about it, right? So Richard Mayer got together with a very good instructional designer, Ruth Clark, and then actually wrote this book, E-Learning and the Science of Instruction. It says e-learning, but it's really about cognitive science and learning. It's a handbook for instructional design. It's in its 4th edition. I've handed out hundreds of these since it first came out in 2000. It's a very valuable starting point. And there's a table in the back that summarizes a whole bunch of research. Things like, if you put graphics and text together the right way, you can get a 1.4 standard deviation lift in learning performance in controlled laboratory conditions. This is science, okay? This is not engineering real world. This is science. If you avoid irrelevant graphics and stories and videos and music and all that, you can get almost a standard deviation of improvement. And sometimes instructional designers think they just need to get people's eyeballs onto a piece of content, and so they'll use a sexy graphic or a fun rock and roll thing or whatever, but it's irrelevant to the thing they're trying to learn. They're actually going to create a distraction as opposed to actually doing something. I won't go through each of these, but these are all backed up by randomized controlled trials published in multiple environments. And these aren't even expensive. Some of it is about, moving the text up on the screen where it applies for graphics. It's not expensive. Some of it is actually about writing simpler, write less words for things that are complicated so you're not cognitively overloading somebody, right? And so this stuff is valuable. And I know many of you, like me, have a bell curve in your living room because many of you are engineers, and it makes for great cocktail party chatter when you're talking about standard deviations over a beer or a martini. But just to remind the few of you who don't actually do that on a regular basis, if you start at the 50th percentile and you move a student 1 standard deviation, and many of those techniques in a laboratory setting were about 1 standard deviation, you lift them to the 84th percentile. So just by putting the graphics and text together, just by stripping away the distractions, you can get that kind of lift in a laboratory setting, right? So if I'm trying to decide, do I want to design using learning styles, which has 0 evidence that it moves learners, or do I want to design using the principles, the multimedia principles I just showed, that has up to and beyond a standard deviation of evidence in laboratory settings, I want to do my engineering with stuff that starts out with a big impact in a laboratory, because I'm going to lose some of that in the real world. when you do this, you can actually make a difference. So we did an experiment at Kaplan, at the virtual university that they had there, Kaplan University, where we actually started with an original version of online learning that was very conventional, where you had lectures online, a lot of readings, discussion groups. The assessments weren't terribly well connected to the actual readings and so forth. It was a pretty traditional kind of a course. And then we threw the cognitive science and motivational science kitchen sink at it. And we did all kinds of things. We got the outcomes and content aligned. We make sure there was just one outcome for each lesson. And if somebody needed to practice two outcomes together, that became an outcome to produce those two things together, and that became the outcome of the lesson that was then assessed. We did motivation analysis. We used some looking at the clickstream data to understand who is actually falling off the pace. Because a student might be failing because they don't understand what's going on, or they might be failing because they're just not wanting to do it anymore. And so we were able to draw signals from their interactions to actually help teachers figure out which was which and feed that to the teachers. So we threw all of this at once at this, and then we did a randomized controlled trial across multiple courses. These were two different courses, about 900 students. We had the original design and then the pilot design using learning science, and we got these large increases in success, where success was defined as the student passed the course, so GPA, the student mastered the critical learning outcomes, and the student came back, which is pretty important. The student actually came back. And we had this, 28% increase in success from those students, which caused Kaplan University and ultimately Kaplan to realize we got to pay attention to some of this learning science stuff. This actually really matters because it has this kind of an impact in the real world itself. So I'm going to finish by talking just briefly about putting this into place in the real world at scale is actually hard. Any of you who've actually tried to do training programs at scale, or any of you who are running university education programs, know this is difficult. So at Kaplan, as we were trying to get 28,000 employees to think about this, 1.5 million students to benefit from this across 20 different learning environments, and now that I'm at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, where we're trying to figure out how to do this across the whole ecosystem, one of the ways to do this is just very similar to standard change management approaches, where you begin by exposing people to what's possible. You show them some of this research, and they often don't even know that there's these kinds of opportunities for big changes in performance that could come from this. You get a few champions to run some experiments like that Kaplan University thing to show, wow, this actually does the thing in the real world. Then you begin to train people in a serious way. You make training programs to help them master how to apply learning science inside constraints, get that to begin to go, and then you have the hard job of now, once you've trained a bunch of people to do it, now you've got to have them do it. And one of the things we learned at Kaplan that I commend to you as a key piece, and that I'm thinking about now at CZI as we're looking at a wider range of learning environments, is to think about the general managers, the people who have their hands on capital and resources and people and are making trade-offs every day. They actually have to have their own miniature version of a learning science understanding so that they actually understand why you're asking for more time for trainers to be retrained. Because sometimes people think, well, they're adults. We sent them the memo. How come they're not doing it now? Well, it's because that's not how minds actually work. You have to give them practice and feedback, even for professional development. And so you need to engage the general managers in helping to actually drive this through. And then finally, the evaluation piece. You have to close the loop. You have to be following what's going on with good measures, both of implementation, but also the outcomes. Look for the weak spots and keep coming back. And this is a normal engineering cycle that begins to allow you to do this kind of work at scale. So to me, this world of learning and training will hugely benefit from the kinds of insights that engineers bring every day to practical solutions grounded in how the world works. We just have to begin to apply what we know about learning and motivation at scale in real-world situations and train folks up to be able to do that repeatedly. So thank you very much for your time and attention. Appreciate it.
A very interesting presentation. I learned a lot from it. Thank you. My question is that learning theories are all in the 20th century, and that they're very subjective, open to interpretation. Surely the way forward is the science of learning, where you understand the basic principles. Then and only then can you achieve what you're trying to do, if you see what I mean. And therefore the science of learning must be defined as something where it is scientifically based, quantitative, provably correct, and that surely must be the foundation and starting point to take us into the 21st century of learning, as opposed to the 20th century terminology such as, you know what I mean, constructivism, behaviorism, etc., etc. I'd welcome your comments on that. Thank you.
So I think this is right, that if we really want to be helping more learners be more successful at complex and important learning outcomes we need from them, both workplace outcomes, academic outcomes, and non-academic personality outcomes, we need to make use of what we are discovering from laboratory work, cognitive psychology work, and ultimately neuroscience work about how our learning machinery actually works. But the trick is, you know, as engineers, you know, just like the chemical engineering example, every pharmaceutical factory is different. And, you know, you apply the principles, you said it exactly right, you apply the principles that you've gotten grounded in evidence to design that next factory as best you can, and then you measure and see, how do we do? How close is this to what we expected, including things like fault trees. You kind of look to see where could this have gone wrong, and then you gather data as you start to run anything that's an engineering solution and see, is it working the way we expected it in all the different parts that we designed? And so there's got to be a lot of humility in engineering always around, okay, I'm putting together the principles as best I can, but you never have an exact answer for, in the case of education, your types of students in their living environments. You have principles and ideas to help you, but then you have to do the iteration. And I think it's those two pieces. One, beginning with a set of principles that are grounded in science as best we can, and then two, measuring and iterating to see how do we improve it from there where it's not working as expected. And I think that's a way forward. I'll say one more word about the neuroscience if I can, because it's interesting. So where neuroscience is right now, to me, is a little bit like where DNA was in the 1960s. So people had discovered that a number of major clinical disorders like Huntington's chorea were actually the result of like point mutations in your DNA. And there were clearly more things going on with the DNA, which was really exciting. But to a clinician, who's kind of a human biological engineer, to a clinician, it didn't do anything. Because, yeah, now I know this patient has this defect. Well, I can't do anything different. You're not helping me yet. And what's happened, of course, over 10 or 20 years of work in molecular biology is brand new treatments emerged that were never available from the original biological understanding of diseases and disorders that have now transformed many diseases. Cancer therapy is likely to never be the same again as a result of this kind of thing. So neuroscience and learning right now are a little bit at the same place, where neuroscience results are beginning to explain some things around working memory and motivation and other pieces, but not yet so much, and therefore here's how you should improve teaching the addition of fractions with unlike denominators in a new way because of neuroscience. We're not there yet, but I think we will get there, because neuroscience is absolutely catching up and is going to be very exciting as time goes on. Another question?
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, speak up though. Speak
Okay.
loud.
Hi, sorry, my English will be very bad, but I'll try. Well, it was a great talk when you gave at MIT in 2016 at Learning at Scale. You were in Kaplan. I think you gave a talk about how data science will prove the learning in the Kaplan, in terms of Kaplan. But my first question is, why did you leave Kaplan and to Chan and Saxberg? And then the second question is, when we see learning, we learn in different ways. We learn by structured, unstructured, online, offline. So I just want to know, how do you see how learning science have been embedded to online learning? Because most of the time what we see is learning as just consuming the content, but real engineering have they picked the learning into the context of e-learning?
So, okay, so two questions. One is, why did I leave Kaplan? Yeah, I had 1.5 million learners, a CEO who was committed, a whole organization of 23,000 people who were going nuts with this stuff. I just met with the head of Kaplan Australia again. He's all excited and doing a bunch of AI stuff and data work. Why would you ever leave something like that? Well, the reason is, so the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative was set up by Priscilla Chan and her husband, Mark Zuckerberg, to put their fortune to work in several different areas, one of which is the education area. And Priscilla Chan is a pediatrician. So she understands how you've got to invest in some of the underlying science and then also invest in applying it in real-world circumstances to actually get solutions. That's how medicine has made a lot of progress over a long period of time. And it can take time. So they are patient about this, but they're also really ambitious. They really want to affect learners ultimately all across the planet, pre-K to post-mortem. Well, maybe not post-mortem, but I mean, they really want to affect all learners. And do this in this multidimensional way, that it's not just your workforce, it's your work components or your academic, it's the non-academic stuff as well. So the ability to move from thinking hard about 1.5 million learners to 7, 8, 9 billion learners, that struck me as a real move to scale. And so that was kind of the reason that I decided to do it. And then the absolute support for using the science to underpin this. So the second question, it gets at what I started out with right at the beginning. So what about electronic learning and online learning and so forth? So as I said at the beginning, you got to get this flipped around the right way. You have to ask, it's like in medicine, right? The way you figure out how to use technology to treat disorders is you first understand the disorder a lot. And then you figure out, okay, among the technologies I have, which ones can I then use to best effect? So depending on your environment, a treatment for malaria may be a molecular issue, a drug treatment, or it could be mosquito nets, depending on where you are and what resources you have available. So I would argue the same thing is true for uses of technology for learning, is we should start from what is the evidence that we have a good way for a mind to practice something and to learn something. And very likely it is not simply sitting and either reading or sitting and listening to a talk. So the funny thing is, I am well aware that I've spent an hour now lecturing at you about why lecturing is a ridiculously bad way to do this, okay? I get this. It's a little bit, ironic. I know this, okay? But in fact, you need to look to see, well, what is the better way to do the learning you're after? And then you can see, how can I use technology to actually do the practice and feedback cycles in more efficient ways than I've done before? Now, aside from early stages in many career areas, I think you're never going to get the expert out of the loop completely, because as soon as you get to foggy, challenging interpretations of issues and what's important, you need a conversation with an expert. You need feedback from an expert. But there's a lot of earlier stuff that might involve getting some things into long-term memory that are fluencies that will allow you to free up working memory for those later conversations. Well, that earlier stuff might well be things that natural language processing, some adaptive ways of doing the learning so that students can really get the practice and feedback they need for the early stuff, and then they can rely on humans and their peers for the more complex judgmental stuff as things goes on. But I would argue start from what is better for learning and then figure out how the technology can actually enable that. And that's where use of simulations, use of hinting systems inside assessments. There's a great Neil Heffernan at Western Polytechnic has a system called assessments, which ties together hinting and assessments at the same time. And he's demonstrated in randomized controlled trials that actually lifts learning and also improves your ability to tell how somebody is doing by watching the pattern of hint uptake that they actually have. So, the trick is to look deeply at the learning first and then find the technologies that enable the better learning. And that's the way to think about it, I think. So.